Hello U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 4, Lesson 2, America in the Roaring Twenties. We're going to start with 1920s consumerism, and this plays a huge role in society because now, as we spoke about in 4.1, Americans have more disposable income. That means they have more money to spend after they've paid all their bills and can afford nicer, fancier stuff because now they're buying on credit, which is not something that we were allowed or able to really do so much prior to the 1920s. So the 1920s sees a burst of personal prosperity. The average American now makes more money and has more disposable income than we've ever seen before. And this leads to a huge rise in consumer spending. Consumers are the people. That is the person that's buying the product. Henry Ford and his assembly line lead to mass production techniques in multiple different industries. And this allows us to make products cheaper, more efficiently, and quicker. So we get a huge number of new products hit the market. For example, cars, your first electric appliances, new fashions for men and for women. And not only that, but these companies that are offering all of these new technologies and these new products are going to allow you to purchase them on credit. That means you will put a down payment, a certain predisposed amount or percentage of the overall price. Let's say you're buying a stove for $100. You can put $10 down, 10%, and then pay $10 a month until you pay off your stove. Installment plans are brand new in the 1920s. People haven't done it before. But not only do people have more money to spend after they pay their bills, but now you can also buy on credit, which is going to make it easier for people to purchase all of these new products. And because of that, well, you got to advertise. So we see a rise in advertisement campaigns, in the newspapers, in magazines. As the radio becomes more popular, we start to hear commercials that are advertising different new products. And all of this is in an attempt to get people to really purchase these new products and spend their money, which is going to, in turn, in some ways, help the economy. We also see the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance really is occurring because of what we call the Great Migration. In the 19-teens, we see a huge rise of African Americans who had previously lived in the South, who had been oppressed by Jim Crow laws, treated unfairly, had to face huge amounts of discrimination in their Southern society, now have a reason to move up north. They're moving up to cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia. And they're moving there because now we're in World War I. We're ramping up production. We've now got these factories that are producing more materials, and they can get jobs. So if you look at our chart here, in 1910, which is the red, there's about 44.1 thousand people living in Chicago. By 1920, only a decade later, 109.4 thousand. That's over double in a decade. New York goes from 91.7 thousand to 152.4 thousand. Not quite double like Chicago, but still a significant rise. And all of the other cities as well have a significant rise in population of African Americans living in their city, because they feel as though if they go north, they're going to have a better life. They know they'll have a job, discrimination might be less, and they might have a new place to raise their families. One of the places that they live is Harlem. This begins the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a flourishing of African American culture, and this is where we get jazz. Harlem is the birthplace of jazz. And jazz really blends African and European musical traditions into a distinctly American style of music. This is the beginnings of a lot of the music that you guys listen to now in 2019. We get huge popular artists like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, and these new types of music, these new sounds that really get a lot of people interested. And it really brings African American music to the forefront of society. We also see authors, and one of the most popular authors of this era that's African American is Langston Hughes. And he writes poems and novels, and we can see a huge amount of works from him that talk about his pride in being African American and in his culture. Because that's what he believes in, so that's what he's going to write about. And Harlem really represents the new Negro. Negro being the polite term for African Americans at the time. And it provides this idea that African Americans don't need to be ashamed for their culture or themselves in general. They can embrace their culture. They can freely express that culture in a multitude of different creative means. And this really starts them to fight for their equality. And we've already seen in the progressive era, like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, that are fighting for African American rights. And now these people have a home. They have a place where they can feel free to express themselves. And that culture then in turn spreads throughout the United States. Not only the music, but the author, Langston Hughes, becomes hugely popular across the country. And we really see a rise of the embracing of African American culture in the era. Women also changed significantly in the 1920s. In the 1920s, we begin the decade with women gaining something that they've been fighting for nearly 100 years. They get the right to vote. The 19th Amendment is passed, and women now have the right to vote. But a lot of them still didn't. Because they're looking at the traditional values and the traditional ways of doing things. Women couldn't vote traditionally. So a lot of women did not vote. We also see the rise of new fashion trends. Ladies were now much more casual in a way. Their collars are not up to their chins. Their sleeves are not down to their wrists. Their skirts do not drag the floor. For the first time, it is acceptable for a lady to show her ankles in public. So hemlines and skirts are getting shorter. And women are getting more leisure time, just like men. Americans in general in the 1920s see a rise of leisure time, and all of this leads to an increased sense of freedom for these women. Advertisers also begin to target women's sexuality and their appearance. And this can be particularly seen in magazine articles and the advertisements that would accompany those articles. For example, you have health soap. Popular men and women use health soap. How's your breath today? For Listerine. And kiss-proof makeup. Because in the 1920s, it's okay for women to start wearing makeup, as in previous decades, it was seen as much more risque or inappropriate for a woman to wear makeup. Many young, unmarried women begin to embrace their independence and their sexuality, and no longer is it unacceptable to not be married by the time you're 20 or 21. And these new modern women who are wearing shorter skirts and cutting all their hair off into bobs and going to movies and going to theme parks and things like that are called flappers. So when you think of a flapper, think of a modern woman breaking with traditional constraints of feminism. Flappers popularized new women's fashions. For example, shorter hemlines. Now it's acceptable for you to show your ankles. Bobbed hair, which is the very short hairstyle that's pretty much to your chin. You just chop all your hair off. Which was very uncommon prior to that, because before that, women would have very long hair and they would pile it up in a bun on the top of their head, and that was the acceptable hairstyle. And many older women in the 1920s would not allow their daughters or their granddaughters to cut their hair off because they saw it as very inappropriate and not traditional. And women start wearing different types of hats as well. And young women are shocking these traditional-minded women because they're smoking cigarettes, they're drinking alcohol, they're dancing in public, and they're wearing makeup. The scandal. And they were also having sex outside of marriage, which was very uncommon. And they're dating boys without chaperones. Prior to that, if you were courting, you could not be left alone. You had to have a chaperone there that would have been a family member. And they're breaking with all of these traditional ties, and they're embracing the new freedoms that they have. In the 1920s, we see a rise in some of the most prolific and important literature that we had seen before. Authors like Ernest Hemingway and T.S. Eliot and F. Scott Fitzgerald really write some very lasting literature. And most important literature of America. And we call these people the Lost Generation. And the nickname the Lost Generation really refers to the people who are coming to age during or just after World War I. And they're viewed this way because of war experiences, the social upheaval at the time, the great amount of changes that are happening, and they're often seen as cynical, disillusioned, and without cultural or emotional stability. Hence, they're just lost. And the most prolific authors of this era were T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. They didn't agree with the war. They didn't agree with consumerism. They didn't like the conforming to society. And it's very interesting that F. Scott Fitzgerald is part of the lost generation because his wife, Zelda, was a flapper. She cut her hair off into a bob. She wore her short hemlines. She was very much your typical 1920s consumerist. In fact, when he first started writing his books, she printed an article in the newspaper saying something along the lines of, if you go out and buy my husband's book, I can get this really cute dress that I saw in the store window on 16th Street. Or if even more people buy my husband's book, I can get this diamond ring I saw in the window at Tiffany's. If even more people buy my husband's book, then I can get this pocketbook I saw at Macy's. And if even more people buy my husband's book, we can get him a new winter coat. But he's been wearing the same one for several years, and it's just fine. Like, she's all about the new modern fashions and technologies and everything. And so it's very interesting, the pair that they make. He's considered the lost generation who rejects all of these things, and she is very much all about those things. We also see the rise in leisure time during the 1920s, which means time that you can spend doing what you want. This leads to people really getting even more interested in sporting events. Sports were a hugely popular form of entertainment because not only are people gaining more free time, but they're gaining more money that they can go and spend to buy a ticket to the baseball game. And the most popular sports that come out of this decade are baseball, boxing, and football. And baseball, even during this time, is really seen as America's sport. It's America's pastime, and it's very traditional, and you've got your icons like Babe Ruth, and later, after baseball is desegregated, you get Jackie Robinson, who comes from the Negro League. You also get boxing greats like Jack Dempsey. And boxing really actually starts in the bars of the immigrant neighborhoods in New York. And they would put on boxing matches that started out as a spectator sport for the people in the neighborhood and eventually became extremely popular for even your fancy rich people living on the Lower East Side or the Upper East Side of New York, going down to these bars and standing in the back, and they're betting on the boxing and they're watching it, and it becomes a huge sport that a lot of people really get into. And not only can you go to these live events, but with the invention of the radio, you can listen to them as well. And radio broadcasts bring these sporting events to national audiences because you can now listen to a Yankees game living in Dallas, or listen to a boxing match that's happening in Philadelphia living in Kansas. It really brings a national community full circle. And that sports also give Americans a new generation of heroes. Babe Ruth of the New York Yankees was the biggest sports hero of the 1920s, and honestly, many people still see him as one of the best baseball players that ever played the sport. But at this point, just like every other aspect of society, baseball is segregated. So they have a Negro League as well, and we get some really great Negro League heroes such as Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson, and eventually Jackie Robinson. Heavyweight boxer Jack Dempsey was so popular that his fights set financial and attendance records in the 1920s because so many people would go out just to watch the fights. Think of that as the precursor to UFC fighting today. And then other sport heroes of the era, Red Gage, Gertrude Earle, and Bobby Jones. Like I said, Now we've got the invention of the radio, which is bringing all of these stories into people's homes. But we've also got movies. Not to say that movies were not invented previously, but we get a new type of movie in the 1920s. Movies and radios become hugely popular in the 20s, and over 500 radio stations really connect the nation because they're broadcasting music, sports, news, religious sermons, comedies, dramatic programming. This really is the precursor to television that comes several decades later. Basically, all of our shows that we see on TV, the idea begins in radio. Tin Pan Alley, which was this musical type variety show type thing, which was where a collection of like music publishers and songwriters and like shows and stuff like that center in New York. And it focuses on things like ragtime, which is a genre of music, dance music, jazz, and they really, I say variety show, but it kind of leads to that down the road. And people like Irving Berlin were the most popular of the composers of the era. And it's just a new type of music and a new way of expressing oneself. The really big thing in the 1920s was talkies. Talking movies are basically movies with sound. Prior to the 1920s, movies did not have sound. You would watch the movie and there would be somebody in the theater playing the piano to add the music, and you would have to read the cue cards. In the 1920s, we get The Jazz Singer, which was the first ever talking picture. And after that, people just cannot get enough of it. And a lot of our silent film stars, such as Charlie Chaplin, make the convert over to talkies and really become hugely popular. By the end of the decade in 1929, over 100 million people go to the movies each week. And very much like radio, where people are really being brought together because you can hear the same radio show in Philadelphia as you do in Los Angeles. You can listen to the same sporting event in New York as you can in Atlanta. Very same thing with movies. Just like now, movies are released, you get to go watch them. And they're released all over the country. So if you have a movie theater near you, you could be watching the same movie at the same time in Oklahoma City as somebody in Detroit. So it's really also a cultural phenomenon because it's really bringing Americans together and closing that divide of the country. Transportation also becomes very important in the 1920s because while we had cars before World War I, they become much cheaper and much more affordable in the 1920s because of mass production techniques and such. Henry Ford's assembly line makes cars much more affordable. And we're going from our $500 and something for a car to $200 and something per car. And more people are being able to afford them because they have more disposable income because their wages are higher. And also we're buying them on credit, so you're making installment payments. By the end of the decade, 1 in 5 Americans owned a car, which is up dramatically from prior to World War I. Car manufacturing at this point becomes the biggest industry in America, with multiple new car companies coming out and trying to sell their vehicles. Cars are a symbol of status. If you can afford to purchase a car, that means you're doing pretty good. And it also gives people a sense of freedom. You can now drive wherever you want to. Granted, roads are not very good, but within reason, you can now travel freely around the country. New roads lead to gas stations because your car needs gas. And shopping centers begin to be built, very similar to what we've got now. For example, this postcard from Kansas City, Missouri is the Country Club Plaza, which is the first ever shopping center, which opens to the public in 1923. And it's the first shopping center in America, which is obviously going to lead to more consumerism because now you've got all these shops that you can go purchase all these goods at. And airplanes really capture Americans' attention in the 20s. Many Americans are exposed to airplanes during the war because they're either building them for the war effort, or we've got some pilots during World War I. Those are called flyboys. And in 1927, Charles Lindbergh really captures the America's attention because he makes the first ever solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. In his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, he flies from North America to France, and he really becomes the biggest celebrity of the 1920s. We also see Amelia Earhart really come of age in the 1920s. That's the first female pilot to make a transatlantic flight later in the 20s. In the 30s, obviously she's tragically lost as she tries to make a circumnavigation of the globe, meaning fly all the way around the world. But America's attention is grabbed by these airplanes, and they really see them as this amazing new technology. That'll bring us to the end of Unit 4, Lesson 2, The Roaring Twenties. See you back here for Unit 4, Lesson 3, and I hope that you have a great day.